Good afternoon. I'm Jim McAdams. I'm the director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. And on behalf of both my institute and the Kroc Institute, which is co-sponsoring this event with us, I want to thank you for coming. This is a tough subject that we're going to converse about today on the panel, but also with you. Terror in Paris and beyond. As I was thinking about how to just quickly frame my own thoughts, I thought about the contrast between Paris and beyond. On the one hand, the events that we have experienced over the last week have a certain immediacy that comes with, for many of us, having walked the streets of Paris, knowing about France, France's relationship with the United States. These events hit home for all Americans very quickly. At the same time, beyond, it's crucial to recognize that when we talk about terror in the world now, we're not just talking about France, despite the immediacy. We're talking about all of the other terrorist incidents. In the 24-hour period in which the French experienced this tragedy, so did many other people in Beirut and in Mali today, Baghdad then. It's incomprehensible when we think about the global implications of these events for all of us, and I mean all of these countries. In thinking about the panel itself, I think there are, among many, many questions, three that will and should occupy our attention. The first is, how do we make sense of the human toll? I've been struck by articles in the New York Times, by accounts on TV about the challenge of talking with children about these events. So how do we make sense of them? Secondly, how do we explain them? ISIS plays a central role, we would all agree, but certainly these events aren't only about ISIS. And then finally, a question for all Americans, and that has huge immediacy in many ways, which we'll discuss in the United States. How do we respond? One thing that I love about the panel today is its diversity. For all of you who know my colleagues, you will know that, gee, how did all of these different people with different perspectives and different fields get together on the same panel? I think this will make for a certain electricity. I'm hoping on the panel, a certain provocativeness that, from which we'll all benefit. First, we have Catherine Perry. Catherine is a professor of French and Francophone literature who is intimately acquainted with Paris, and particularly with the suburbs of Paris. Secondly, we have Peter Wallenstein, who's a professor of peace studies, a European, somebody who can give us a broad European perspective on these events, but also somebody who has a global perspective. Third, we have my colleague in political science, Michael Desch, who is also the co-director of the Notre Dame National Security Program, who's very interested in security studies, also military responses to terrorism. And finally, we have Olivier Morel, who's a professor of media studies, and has deep personal connections with the city of Paris. I have asked each of my colleagues to speak for 10 minutes. Let's see how they do with that. And we've experienced this before. Professors are not very loquacious, so you have to kind of encourage them to go on. 10 minutes. And then I'm going to open the floor for many, many questions, I hope. Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim, for inviting me to participate, and I also thank the Kroc Institute for my participation. It's a little intimidating to go first with a subject like this, and obviously I have personal ties to Paris. I've been there a lot. I did a lot of research there. My daughter lives there. My son-in-law lives there with his children, and I have very dear friends there too. So my first thought was for them, and everybody is doing well. Now, what I thought I would do, since I am since I work in literature, I'm going to give you a more literary point of view and discuss responses essentially by two writers who are Muslim and who had a lot to say these days. And I hope my slideshow is going to work. Yes. All right, so I've entitled this Muslim Writers and Intellectuals on the Paris Attacks. But first, I would like to refer to Émile Zola, a French writer of the 19th century, who wrote the novel Nana in 1880. And he wrote about a devastatingly beautiful courtesan in Paris who symbolizes French pleasures, all the sensual pleasures, and who eventually dies of smallpox. Upon seeing her disfigured beauty, a friend of hers exclaims, she has changed, she has changed. It's a little bit the way I feel about Paris after the attacks. And then the poet I worked on for many years, Anna de Noailles, wrote in a personal notebook in 1907, "No one has control over those who do not fear death." And that applies both to ISIS terrorists as well as to us as a way of responding, not being in fear. So now let me move on first to Tahar Ben Jelloun, who is a Moroccan novelist and essayist. He was born in Morocco in 1944, and he lives in Paris, but also goes to Morocco quite a bit. He received, among many awards, the Prix Goncourt in 1987. It's a very prestigious prize. And in response to 9/11, he wrote a book, Islam Explained to Children and to Their Parents, 2002, re-edited 2012. And he wants to be the public voice of Muslim reason and wisdom. So he is very much a public figure and intervenes in events like this with his words. It's very much a war of words and interpretations, and I think that's why literature is relevant to this discussion. So on November 14, and I just translate and paraphrase, he said there are two characteristics of ISIS that are foreign to European values and culture. It has replaced the instinct of life with that of death, both given and accepted. It controls the initiative and has the advantage of surprise. Europe is not prepared for this kind of war. Preventive steps would run into legal obstacles, he says. For instance, we can't just invade a home. We have to have a legal procedure for that. And vigilance, he says, will have its limits. So sleeper commando squads will reawaken, so we're never safe. And there remains the long-term solution, according to him, of education, which means teaching the values of life and freedom, of democracy and respect for others, along with concrete steps. And then, again, on November 17th, so this is different days since the attacks, he said, just as Muslim authorities have done in Morocco, Muslim authorities in France must forcefully denounce the terrorist manipulations of the Quran. The ISIS communique that claimed the attacks refers to the Quran, 2 verses in particular. In Surah, that's chapter 59, verse 2, mentions the disbelievers from the people of the scripture, people of the book, that's the Jews and the Christians, who went into exile and thought their strongholds would protect them from Allah. And I quote the verse, "But Allah reached them from a place whereof they recked not, and cast terror in their hearts." This is a translation of Marmaduke Pickthall. And then there's Surah 63, verse 8, which refers to the hypocrites who disregard the power of Allah. So the ISIS terrorists used these 2 verses to justify their attacks, according to Benjelloun. So he says that theologians in Morocco pronounced a fatwa condemning these attacks, and they defined the meaning of jihad as an effort upon oneself through education, knowledge, and responsibility. The Maliki doctrine of the Sharia, which is the doctrine used in North Africa and other regions in the Muslim world, according to Benjelloun, is a doctrine of moderation which adapts to modern life. Islam has lived peacefully, he says, before the eruption of Islamic radicalism. And the Islamist interpretation of the Quran is caricatural, devoid of imagination, symbols, and intelligence. Of course, for a writer like him, that's pretty obvious. And it is the duty of European Muslim citizens to privilege freedom of interpretation. So the Quran stresses, according to him, that each person is responsible for their conscience. And finally, the victims of November 13, he said, were people of all creeds, colors, and political tendencies. And the Muslims in Europe who live and work peacefully are now the ones who are going to pay for what happened, unless they really become active. They will be distrusted, have fingers pointed at them, their job applications will be rejected, they will be searched, humiliated by an angry police force, serve as foils for politicians, and they will shoulder the responsibility of the progression of the fascist and racist extreme right. In conclusion, for Benjelloun, the Muslim world, no matter how divided and diverse it is, should now speak with one voice and take all necessary measures to destroy this barbarity. A few days earlier, he said in a debate with a historian of religions, he referred to the philosophy of the Mu'tazilites from the 8th to the 10th centuries who privileged an open, universal value version of the Quran. And he says it is this Islam that we may qualify as an Islam of enlightenment. That's what he is aiming for. But literalists gained influence, and the Wahhabi movement was founded in the 18th century. And Benjelloun says the misfortune of the Muslim world comes from the narrow reading of the Quran, which has given birth to bands of criminals and savages. That was printed November 18, but the debate happened a little earlier. So here's a picture of transition. And now we go to Boualem Sansal, another novelist and essayist who is Algerian and was born in 1949, so roughly the same generation as Benjelloun. He wrote in 2008 a novel translated as The German Mujahid, in which he basically links Islamist radicalism with Nazism, and some of my students here have read it. He received many awards, very prestigious, even in Germany, a Peace Prize, the Arab Novel Prize in 2012, which he was unable to collect because they removed it from him after he went to visit Israel. And this year, he published his latest novel, 2084, subtitled The End of the World. And that is a novel that imagines the world controlled by ISIS-like characters. And he won for this novel the Grand Prix de l'Académie Française. How am I doing for time? A few minutes, right? Okay. So he had things to say about the Paris attacks. He said on the 17th of November, Islam is very dangerous through its brutal totalitarian aspects. So he's not like Ben Jelloun. He's not reinterpreting Islam in a peaceful wisdom sense. He's interpreting it as more violent. Islam has become a terrifying law, he says, which edicts interdictions, banishes doubt, and whose zealots are increasingly violent. Islam needs to find its spirituality again, and that Ben Jelloun would agree. This is really the saving grace for Islam in a way, is if people go towards the more spiritual dimensions. He says one must liberate Islam, decolonize, and socialize it. Then I'm going to skip this. He's just being very lucid in his way about what is going on with ISIS. And he asks, what is exceedingly dangerous? Is it Islamism sinking into madness that will self-destruct and destroy the world? Or is it Islam depleting itself and bursting like a fragile ice floe? Is it the sterile organizational mode of Arab Muslim societies, which are patriarchal, feudal, tribal, clannish, hyper-centralized, constantly opposed to their times, to modernity, and to the other? The fact is that Islamism in all its forms, moderate, Salafist, Wahhabi, and jihadist, and Islam in its identitary, that's a new word, version, are energetically spreading through the world and creating solid, autarkic bastions in Muslim countries as in the heart of the materialistic West. He says materialistic West. And even in countries that are anchored in their traditions, like China and Japan. And in these territories, a new culture is developing as well as a new language. So Boulam Sansal participated yesterday in a TV show called La Grande Librairie, the Great Bookstore. So that was November 19. And he talked about the need for silence in the midst of all the confusion and the noise that results from these attacks. He says we are in a new era with the risk of being led towards evil. And there, when he says we, he means Europe, the West. The rapid loss of values, as in Algeria, because he said the reaction could be so strong that we would lose our values, our democratic values. And Algeria lost a lot of its values, according to him, after the civil war of the 90s. And his novel, 2084, can be read as a warning. Others say it's Islamophobic, and yet others say it is pedagogical, revealing a historical process that is very likely. And finally, I just wanted to say a word about the younger generation. And on the same show is Leila Slimani, who was a journalist and a novelist born in 1981 in Morocco. And she says in this same show, she belongs to a generation that has known mostly the violence of extremism because she's young. She agrees that her parents were too submissive. They didn't respond enough in front of the danger of Islamism. And she talks about extremists rejecting fictional literature because it is a work of imagination, the glorification of lies, therefore an emanation of Satan. And for extremists, there is no other world than the one God has created, according to how they look at it, whereas literature creates many worlds. And my conclusion will be on the importance of reading Marcel Proust. It's in the same, it's in the same show. Here there is a man called Raphael Lioger, author of The Myth of Islamization, 2012. He constantly reads and rereads all 3,000 pages of Proust's novel In Search for Lost Time. And he says it contains everything and questions simplification. It resists simplification. Proust encourages encourages us to write. He says, we're all writers, narrative beings. And he says even terrorists are writers, albeit bad writers who are trying to write a page of their lives. But it is something closed that can translate into incommensurable cruelty. And with that, I will let the following person take my place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. When I look at the situation that we saw last week in Paris, what strikes me is the number of young people that were killed. There was one young student from my hometown in Sweden who was killed. There was a young student from Long Beach in California that was killed. There were 3 students from Chile that were killed. So this is not just a Paris event. It's not just something that affects Paris or France. It's really a global event, and I think that's why we are here today. And it's for me shocking that young people become the targets in this particular way, because this is of course the hallmark of terrorism, that you target people who are basically unprepared, uninvolved, innocent in the whole political situation. I normally call it one-sided violence, but we can call it terrorism, of course, if we want to. And it has a political purpose. That is what separates this from other kind of assassinations and attacks on young people in schools and so on. This is organized from somewhere, and we are gradually understanding how it was organized. And I think that gives us a clue to where to look if we are going to understand these events. They are not necessarily something coming out of a particular religion or a particular place. It is an organization behind this, and that has to be our focus. So that's what I will try to look at today. So my reflections in the framework here is not Paris, it is more the beyond, geographically the beyond. But let me just say one thing about Paris, and that is in January we all said, Je suis joli. We have not said that this time, and we are reacting in a different way. I think we should say nous sommes parisiens, tout le monde, because this is what it is all about. It is a challenge to all of us, wherever we are, and what happened in Paris can happen in so many other places. But I think we need to see a broader picture, and I'll just give you 3 points in these 10 minutes I have. I understand these are academic 10 minutes, so I'll have time to explore them. The first one is, of course, that we are facing a very turbulent situation. The world, basically since the surprising events in what we call the Arab Spring in 2011, has really developed into a new phase where many things are not as they were before. And particularly, I would say, the hallmark of this is fragmentation. Lots of groups, lots of actors, which are hard to comprehend and hard to analyze. And I can notice that a lot of people have failed in their analysis of what is going to happen. Terrorism studies for a long time have talked about lone wolves as the key thing. Well, what we see here is not lone wolves. This is very well organized. Others have claimed that IS and groups like that are basically only in their own region. Well, they are obviously wrong. And Jim and others have already documented this. In the last month, there is about 400 people that have been killed outside the region, all at least claimed by IS. There is the downing of the Russian airplane, 200 people killed. There is the events in Beirut that was mentioned, 45, 50 people killed. There is the attack in Paris, 130 people killed. Now we can also perhaps, we'll see, add Bamako, but I'm not sure. It could be another group that is involved here. But still, it suggests that this is a movement that is behind this, which has a very global perspective on what it is doing. And indeed, if you go back a little further, you will see that there were attacks in Dhaka in Bangladesh. An Italian aid worker was killed there in September. There were attacks at a peace rally in Turkey in September. There are actions in Libya, there are actions in Kuwait, which all are claimed by IS. So it is a very particular actor that we need to be particularly concerned about and understand a little where it comes from, and in order to be able to deal with it. And I think what we need then to think and look at is really the Arab world, particularly after the Arab Spring. How does it function? And I think you can say that the basic categories here are ethno-religious groups. And I tend to forget that. So the majority population here is Sunni, which is an ethnic group, you can say. It is a religious grouping. It is some way in which you create affinity among people in the Arab world. The minority groups are the Shiites. And then you have the Christians, and then you have other groups, etc. So you can go on and see that it is really fragmented. And within each group, you will also find the dimension of left-right. You will also find dimensions of family connections. Many of those in doing the thing in Paris were actually closely related. So it's a very complicated picture, and that's what I mean with fragmentation. It's not so easy to say exactly which group is the one we, the West, should support or engage with, and which one is the one that we should be most negative to. We need to think very carefully here, what are the alliances that can be done. And what for me should be a point of departure would then be the Sunni group, the majority group. Who is protecting the majority group? Who is representing the majority group? And are we, the Western world, in some sense, relating to this particular group? And if you look at the history, the very quick history, you will see that there has been a continuous ambition to antagonize exactly this group. Saddam Hussein, of course, was a member of this. When he fell, who was then protecting the Sunnis? Unclear. For a while the US did, then the US left. Who was then protecting it? The Sunnis are the majority in Syria. Who is protecting that majority? Assad regime is a minority regime. Again, you can see that IS steps in here and proclaims itself to be the protector. And it becomes really difficult for people who are in the Sunni groupings to go against IS, because they may protect them anyway better than a Shiite government or an Alawite government or a Kurdish group, etc. So I think there is a dynamic here where the Sunni majority is, so to say, captured and blocked from acting. And how we should relate to them, I'm not sure. I'm just saying that that might be one of the keys we should look at when we deal with this particular issue. We can come back to that in the discussion, how to deal with that. So fragmentation and how to find a policy in fragmentation. The second is what is the appropriate response? President Hollande is talking about war. Okay, you can talk about war, but be aware what you say when you say war. It means very quickly that you exclude a lot of other alternatives. It means that you will listen to those who come with war strategies, military people, commentators, etc. And you risk losing the perspective that there are other things you can do. And what are the other things? I'm now thinking directly in relationship to the Arab world as I outlined it. And I think there are a number of other things we need to think about. And for me, a key consideration always when you deal with terroristic activity is to follow the money. Where does the money come from, and what can we do to disrupt the money? And I've seen in the past week almost no discussion on this. And I even emailed a friend in the UN and asked, what is the UN doing about this? And clearly, so far, nothing. But financial sanctions is a way in which you can actually jeopardize a number of these groups. And you think about it, and Stephen Walt had an interesting article in Foreign Affairs a week ago, trying to estimate how strong, how rich is actually IS. We say it's the richest terrorist group, but how rich does that mean that it is? And his calculations say that they have about in the area, they have a production, so to say, of about 4 to 8 billion US dollars. It sounds a lot but that is actually equal to Barbados. The annual revenues he is calculating is that IS has about $500 million a year. I think that is about 1/10 of Notre Dame. So, we should not overestimate this strength of this organization. And how do they use the money? Well, they pay soldiers with the money. How much do they get? $350, $500? There was a frontline report from Afghanistan about IS in Afghanistan the other day. They claimed that people were switching from the Taliban to ISIS because they pay $700 a month. These are not huge sums, and I think they are, of course, possible to detect and isolate and deal with. So I would argue that if we just talk about war, we forget that there are quite a number of fairly simple measures that probably can be quite effective in derailing these kind of organizations. The third point, and consuming my last minute, is of course, where is peace in all of this? Being a peace scholar, that's what I'm interested in. How do we get out of these situations? And is there any way of finding a negotiated outcome out of this? Well, you can see that 2 days after the 13th, there was a meeting in Vienna. John Kerry was there together with the Russian Foreign Minister, Mr. Lavrov. What were they doing? Well, they were outlining some kind of negotiated way out of the Syrian problematique. And they are inviting parties to a conference by January 1st. This is the sort of Vienna agreement. There is also already a basic agreement among these powers that what needs to be done is a change of government in Damascus. Mr. al-Assad needs to step down. Exactly how is that going to be done? That's the key issue, and will they actually do that? But it seemed to me to suggest that there are ways in which we can think about how to get out of this situation. And one is obviously who rules in Damascus, and how can we replace that very repressive regime with something which is more attractive, and given the analysis I've just given you, a regime that is more friendly to the Sunni majority and does not consist only of minorities of various sorts. A difficult thing, you can imagine a constitution that can deal with this, but you also, of course, need to have political realities that deal with this. Not impossible, but hard to think about today. And that's basically why I raise it here, that we need to have this into our minds as well. It's not just war. There are other things that we need to think about, and we need to think a little long term how to eventually pull ourselves, the world, out of this and not see a repetition of the events that we have seen in the last week. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, so I told my wife I was going to be on a flash panel this Friday, and she said, "What's a flash panel?" And I said, well, it's a panel put together in response to really timely issues where the participants basically shoot from the hip. She looked at me and she said, "How's that different from any other talk that you give?" So I want to take a little bit different focus in two senses. Jim introduced me as a national security guy, and I am. I don't want to run away from it, but I don't want to focus so much on the security piece. And secondly, I want to focus specifically on Europe. And I have a somewhat provocative title, "What's the Matter with Europe?" On terrorism. And I don't want you to think that this is a blame the victim sort of pitch. But I do, the thing I want to get across to you is there are some unique elements about Europe that make European countries particularly vulnerable to the sort of events that we saw last weekend in Paris, and we've seen, unfortunately, on a number of other occasions. Now, I think there are basically three problems that Europe faces: geography, the open borders of the Schengen area, connected with the lack of deep security ties and cooperation among the European countries. And then finally, the large and unevenly assimilated Muslim populations in these countries. So geography, I mean, this is pretty straightforward, and it's also not something that Europe can do anything about. It has the misfortune of being proximate to a number of areas of the world that are quite distressed and where there's a lot of upheaval that's basically spilling over, whether it's refugees coming north from Africa or refugees and political violence coming from the Middle East. Okay. Now, the issues, or the first set of issues that the Europeans could deal with that are policy issues is the question of border control. And as you know, a number of the European countries, not all of them, signed on to an agreement that basically makes it possible for travelers to, within this area, travel without being checked at borders once you get into it. And this was done for all sorts of good reasons. It saves money, it facilitates commerce and tourism and things like that, but it does have a downside. And the downside is that it makes it very hard to track the movement of people within this area. The second and related issue is that European security cooperation is not non-existent, but it's also not very robust. I found this cartoon, I don't know if you can read it, it says Interpol, and there's a guy with a Julian Assange wanted poster, and he's saying to his colleagues, damn it, I don't know what he's wanted for, look it up on WikiLeaks. And the truth of the matter is that this is a reflection of the fact that the European internal security architecture is almost non-existent. Now, individual countries still have the internal security and police apparatuses that they've had for a long time, but one of the things that's coming out about the most recent attack in Paris is that a number of the attackers were based in Brussels. And in fact, the Belgian authorities were aware that these guys were potential troublemakers, but there was a disconnect in terms of communication with the French. And in fact, you can't really blame them. There's just, it's sort of like the United States in some respects before 9/11. There was a lack of institutionalized cooperation on these security issues. Okay, now the rhinoceros in the room in Europe is the presence of large Muslim populations. And this map gives you a breakdown of the percentage of the total population by Western European country that's made up of Muslims. And France is about 7.5%, Germany is almost 6%. This is significant. Here's the first pop quiz. What do you think the percentage of the American population is that's made up of Muslims? 4%? 2%? All wrong. It's 0.8%, less than 1%. Okay, so now this matters because it's pretty clear that out of these populations in Europe are coming significant number of people who've become radicalized, and I measure that by looking at the percentage or the per million percentage of the population of people who are estimated to be fighting with ISIS in Syria. And of course, Belgium is way up there, Denmark and France, and the United Kingdom. So there's a problem here, and it's a serious problem. Now, I think that the root of the problem is that there's been a failure of assimilation, okay? And the data for that, there are a number of sources of data, but the most compelling I found was the results of a major study that the Open Society Institute did in Europe in 2009. And the basic question, they were interviewing Muslims in 10 major European cities, and they asked them, you know, if you're in Amsterdam, do you feel Dutch? If you're in Leicester, do you feel British? If you're in Stockholm, do you feel Swedish? And the fact of the matter is that in a lot of these cases, in fact, the average is less than 50%, Muslims do not feel a part of these countries. And so there seems to be a continuing problem of assimilation. And this is more, I think, acute given that many of these populations are relatively speaking older. I mean, these aren't people that, you know, just came up the railroad tracks from Greece through Hungary and got off in Paris. These are people, in the French case, who are second generation and maybe even third generation immigrants to these countries. And that is really worrisome. Now, I'm no expert on assimilation, and I didn't even stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. So you got to take anything I say about this with a grain of salt. But I'm going to draw a contrast with the United States and then make an argument about what I think the problem is. And again, Jim told me just come and shoot from the hip, so that's what you're going to get. Blame him if you don't like it. Why is this sort of thing, relatively speaking, less of a problem here in North America, particularly in the United States? Well, a big reason is geography. We're much further away. We have an immigration problem, but it involves people immigrating through our own hemisphere. And the percentage of immigrants, illegal immigrants, that we get from outside this hemisphere is minuscule. So it's a completely different issue, and it's almost exclusively a function of geography. Secondly, the United States is one country. Used to be, in the old days, the United States was a plural noun. Now it's a singular noun. And what it means is at the level of the federal government, intelligence collection and law enforcement are well integrated. And after 9/11, they became even more well integrated. In fact, so well integrated that maybe we've gone too far. But in any case, very well integrated. Thirdly, we have, relatively speaking, a very small Muslim population, less than 1% of our total population. But for me, the most important thing is that American Muslims feel better integrated into American society than Muslims in Europe do. And I don't have Open Society data on this, but I do have data from the Pew Research Center. It's sort of striking when American Muslims are asked about their satisfaction with the way things are going, how much higher it is than the general public, and how much it has gone up in a period that has been quite tumultuous in other respects. And so, you know, whatever the reason for this, and I have some ideas about it, American Muslims are pretty happy being here. So the question is why? And I'm just going to throw something out, and we can argue about it in the Q&A. I think the issue, one of the most important issues, this isn't a bombs and rockets issue, it's about theology. And it's about the competing types of secularism in Europe and in North America. North America, or the United States, is officially a secular political regime. We have a government based on separation of church and state. But we also have a very religiously devout population. Religion is part of the woof and fabric of American life, and many of us think that, in fact, this goes back to the whole notion of the separation of church and state. It wasn't to remove religion from public life, but rather it was to make it possible for multiple religions to coexist within a democratic political system. And I have this graphic here. How do you think yourself? Think of yourself, another Pew question. And the question was, you know, do you think of yourself as a Muslim first, an American first, or both equally? Well, they also asked that same question of Christians. And the thing that's sort of striking is that many Americans feel themselves to identify with their religious identity first. And in that sense, they're not all that different from Muslim Americans. And in fact, it's not a huge problem because this is sort of the good old American way. Now, contrast that with the notions of secularism in Europe, and particularly the French notion of laïcité. Did I pronounce it correct? Laïcité, which is a different notion of secularism. A much more, at least to my way of thinking, all-embracing notion of secularism. And I want to throw out, or I want to leave with you the possible hypothesis that it's these competing notions of secularism that may explain a big part of the difference between the situation of Muslims in Europe and the situation of Muslims in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you also, Ruth Abbey, the Kroc Institute, the Nanovic Institute. I recognize a few students in this room, and I want to say, okay, today I'm going to be as loquacious as usual, but there's a reason why I'm loquacious. It's because I'm speechless today. If I'm loquacious, it's because I'm speechless. Cartoonists in January, music lovers and musicians in November, young people of mixed origins, races, and religions, students, creators, and bon vivants, as we call them, Jewish too, always, friends. So this is a flash panel. Emergency is leading, and it is disturbing to speak at this rhythm. And especially in an emergency situation, I have to confess that I had a real hard time concentrating on this little presentation, which is a direct result of the situation. Vicious circle. I will draw circles for you today. Broken circles, scary circles, very large at first, and then they will get smaller and smaller. Less than 11 months ago, we were here in this same room, and we all knew that what happened in Paris in January was not an isolated event. Yet, it is still unreal to be here again today. I guess that is the very first structure of the event that dictates, while absolutely unique and unexpected, Friday's attack also prolongs something that we feared could happen again. This fear is what leads the local, very local, and also the international reactions from the Stade de France to the 11th arrondissement to our state of Indiana, where the governor declared on Tuesday that he would no longer accept Syrian refugees. Let me remind you, Indiana accepted 20 Syrian refugees in 2015. That's what's at stake. Assuming that the Syrian passport, by the way, who was found on one of the crime scenes last Friday, actually belonged to the person, the individual who pushed the button of his suicide bomb at the Stade de France. We still don't know. What it reveals is not rational politics, but a state, again, a state of emergency, a collective paranoia that the attackers precisely wanted to create. One might comprehend that as the zero level of politics. But history and political philosophy also teach us that the state of exception is what defines the sovereign's ultimate political power. Now, what I have to say today is also led by the state of exception, like I said. Not only because the French president declared that the state of exception was effective in the minutes that followed the attacks, but also because more and more the state of exception is probably one of the defining features of our time. That is our relationship to time, to each other as citizens, to space, to institutions, to what we say over the phone, what we teach to our students, the emails we send, our public appearances like today. It contaminates our freedom, our academic freedom, and its unconditional right to ask questions. The same state is what prompted the US to start the so-called global war on terror 13 years ago, while coining a political notion that still remains obscure as the legal ground that justifies the drone war led by the Obama administration, for example. And this is only an example, but thousands of people, including hundreds of civilians, one American citizen, one Italian citizen too, have died and still die daily because of these drone strikes that, as a matter of fact, have been used by ISIS as a very powerful tool in their recruitment discourse attempts. Remember the words originally written in French by the philosopher, also a refugee, Walter Benjamin, in his famous 8th thesis in 1940. When the state of exception becomes the rule, the police takes over, and we live in a time of oppression. The tension inherent to the notion of state of exception is that it suspends the rule of law from which it emerges. Emergency. Last summer, I was scheduled to talk about the Charlie Hebdo attacks in an international conference to be held in Paris. It was cancelled after the organizer, the University of London, felt that there was a threat. The first largest circle I'd like to draw would point out at the global cinematic power that I will call performative power that ISIS is engaging. ISIS has a global strategy as a producer of images. This is a cinematic power. Not only are those images designed to communicate about their victories in a traditional informative way, but they are also gruesome, deadly performances, the performance of their crimes, meant to lead to other performances. In a sense, and I carefully pronounce those words, don't get me wrong, ISIS is a powerful producer of moving images. Moving in all senses of the word. Hypnotic images that attract and move, set in motion huge masses of compassionate people around the world in the universal work of mourning and endless dying that reunites us today. I have to tell you, I mean, the scene is that, do I turn off the news or do I watch? I'm moved, but I'm also attacked, in a sense. That's what ISIS wants to produce, of course, this feeling. But of course, it also sets in motion, let's not forget that, their goal is here. It also sets in motion the pariahs, the outcasts, the relegated individuals that ISIS desperately attempts to recruit with those images. What makes us sick is both what happens and the visual production that this violence generates at an unprecedented level. ISIS has perfectly understood that plugging this haptic power, this is a power to touch, haptic, this haptic power to globalized media coverage is central in the state of exception symbolized by the domination of the breaking news paradigm on the televisual front of the war on terror. Today, cinematic image and mass violence on huge scales are a part of ISIS's geopolitical power. This feature, I quote Olivier Roy, a sociologist, in the New York Times on November 16. This feature, ISIS's media power, has attracted thousands of volunteers drawn by the idea of fighting for global Islam rather than for a peace of the Middle East, end quote. What it creates, second large circle, is what I call the obsidional complex, that is the state of siege and the paranoid pathology that it generates among those who are threatened. But this obsidional fear, like in ancient history, is not limited to the walls of a city. The characteristics that dominates our obsidional complex is that it is without walls, without borders, without any limits. This is the definition of panic. This is a ghostly power that, in a sense, is also a defining feature of our time, of the time of cinema, and cinema is a spectral form of art, instrumentalized as morbid propaganda by ISIS. What I'm pointing out here is that the cinematic power of attraction, this haptic power, captured by ISIS, creates a global spectral fear whose unlimited extension fuels our global state of emergency. Fighting ISIS also consists of fighting this hyperbolic, ghostly presence. It is profoundly disturbing because it is a deconstructive structure. In a cinematic world, the risk will always be that the more you fight ISIS, this cinematic power, the greater it becomes. In other words, what kind of cinema could defy that ghostly hyperbolic power? If you look at the accounts of the people who were the target last Friday, they say, I wanted to watch the news, but this was even more traumatizing to watch the news because I had the feeling that I was supporting the violence that ISIS, the cinematic violence that ISIS was producing, which enlightens another paradox. If it is a deconstructive structure, our response to ISIS, like the response to Al-Qaeda, will always be caught up in this aporia, this dead end, that it can create violence, that it can create the violence that it wants to eradicate at the same time. It is impossible to comprehend the historic defeat of the war on terror as led by the US since 9/11 without refining this historic contradiction. It produces the hyperbolic forms of violence that we see where a supposed fundamentalist, neo-archaic form of ideology, that of the ISIS militants, coexists with hyper-modern tele-technological attacks that would not have been possible without the use of highly sophisticated means of communication. Using sophisticated technologies in the name of an apparent pre-modern interpretation of the religious tradition, documenting then their own acts of violence, doing it in settings that will ensure them a tremendous hyper-real, globalized media reaction, like it's the case in Paris, is a central part of the performance of ISIS's crimes. You probably have seen, Abaoud's gruesome selfies and him boasting and bragging on those videos. Among the last words that he left was, "At least I know that I will be on TV on the day I die." Terrorism as a form of political violence would not have existed without this structure. Nous sommes en guerre, we are at war on November 13. Nous sommes dans la guerre, which doesn't mean anything. We are in the war on November 18, said the French president. A lot like his predecessor, Nicolas Sarkozy, François Hollande is notorious for his misuse of the language. Yes, we have a long tradition of Hollandisms, and from a purely grammatical perspective, what the French commander-in-chief often says does not make sense at all, and my students know it very well. No joke, this is about the war in this case. War, why war, and which war? A lot like the paradox that I was pointing out about the legality of the state of exception and about the media, the cinematic power, it seems to me that the very first effect that the word war will produce, pronounced by the French president, that the word war will produce will be of crediting ISIS's rhetoric that there is actually a war and that the cowards who kill defenseless, unarmed, innocent partiers are warriors. This occurs in an environment where the threat is spectral and the attackers are not leading a conventional war. Now, I'm not saying that these acts are not necessarily acts of war, but I believe that the concept of war has to be refined, which is at stake since 9/11. And there are, of course, many people who do that, but it's a very risky reflection that we are engaging here. We can no longer fully rely on the concept of war as it was shaped after the Second World War, and that has many implications. I am convinced that the vague, undefined notion of war embedded in the expression war on terror cannot be separated from the failure of the invasion of Iraq that in effect also generated ISIS. That is where the difficulty of the current state of emergency lies. ISIS's goal is not to engage in a conventional war between nation states, but to polarize societies, cultures, values, to defy personal choices and orientations, to pollute our imagination. I had nightmare, right? To pollute our since Friday, including our cinematic imagination, while attempting to destroy the beauty, the iconic, the cinematic artistic beauty of Paris, the most photographed city in the world. That's why they targeted this cosmopolitan, open-minded, this racially and religiously diverse neighborhood of Paris, which leads to my final, small, very small circle. While I feel very fortunate to have not lost any close friends in the attack, I have spent many hours worrying about some of them, about their relatives and friends. The 11th arrondissement, where 4 of the 6 attacks took place, the deadliest ones, is also the one where the Charlie Hebdo attack, the Charlie Hebdo assassinations took place in January. In this perimeter that is not much bigger than our campus, I had my last address in Paris, 6 Rue Mercœur, 5 minutes away from the Bataclan, the concert hall, where I used to go. This is where Alison and I pronounced the word mariage for the first time, thanks to UCLA's abroad program, a program not unlike those Notre Dame funds and support. Rest in peace, rest in power, rest in music, Nohemi Gonzalez. She was the target. She's the student from Cal State, Long Beach. This is also where I have most of my closest Parisian friends. This is not a typical tourist neighborhood. This is the most cosmopolitan, I repeat that. There were also Muslims who died in the attack. And Muslims are the biggest victims of this violence. So this is the most cosmopolitan, not the fanciest. It used to be the cheapest, the most genuinely artistic and musical, the freest, Boulevard Voltaire. They also attempted to kill Voltaire. This was the target. On Friday night at 11:35, we get closer and closer, very small circles. My friend Etienne Davodo, author of best-selling fiction and non-fiction graphic novels, posted on Facebook that his daughter was in the Bataclan. It took way too long until we learned that she was physically, and I say physically, safe. Another friend lives across from the Bataclan. He was in the Stade de France, 2 explosions, and was scared about his teenager son, who regularly goes to the Bataclan Café. Physically safe too, but still, they were the target. Céline, my dream producer, one of my closest friends, sent me the message that will be read in a second by Maggie McDowell. Thank you, Maggie. She too knows, as well as her 5 children and husband, her brother, music producer, and his friends and employees, that they all were the target. Cartoonists in January, music lovers, musicians and creators in November, people who just love life. Since Friday, I feel that I'm wandering around with my target on my heart. We are the target. We are the ugly perverts, I quote, that ISIS wants to eradicate. We are ugly, but we have the music, says Leonard Cohen. We free thinkers and creators are all Parisians. And as true Parisians, in spite of the rough elements, we will not sink. Fluctuat nec mergitur. This is the motto of Paris. Fluctuat nec mergitur. Maggie?
Olivier, spending 48 hours with what ifs. What if Félicie had not canceled her music lesson? If she had gone, as usual, she would have been on the Rue Alibert exactly at the same time when the attack took place. What if Sidonie's theater performance had not finished late? Instead of coming across the police and medical vehicles on her way home, she could have encountered the black car. And what if our friend, whose bar we used to hang out in the 11th arrondissement, had not just opened a restaurant in the 18th arrondissement? We could have found ourselves in the middle of the drama on Friday, near the place he used to own on Rue de la Fontaine-au-Roi, where we have spent countless evenings with our friends. Not to mention all our dear co-workers at Zadig, who go out in this neighborhood every evening after work. Those in their 20s and 30s who love to live. The target. The question I have heard over and over this weekend is everyone okay around you? Around here, everyone knows someone. My dear brother had his entire team in the Bataclan. He produces this band. He spent the whole night on Friday calling them. He himself was attending another concert. He was able to talk to some of them over the phone while they were in the Bataclan during the attack, before the police showed up. 2 of them were not answering. Shortly before noon on Saturday, after having searched in the hospitals, he learned that they had died. They were 2 young members of his close team, whom he adored. I have never seen my brother in such a state. Right now, I fear the moment when my kids have to go back to school this morning. There will undoubtedly be some families we know who have been hit. I know that our reaction should not be driven by the criterion of proximity just because it happened nearby. But this is not happening close. It is happening to us. When I think of all the people in this world who have dealt with similar anguish and horror on a daily basis for decades now, it's horrible. I'm a little ashamed of this, but I think that it is only now that I realize what that means. Céline.
These are all quite powerful presentations. We have about 15 minutes for questions. I would request, first of all, that you keep your questions very short so we have time for all of the participants to speak. Secondly, it's the custom of the Nanovic Institute that we always begin with students. So there we shall begin.
And please wait for a microphone to ask your question so that we can record it.
It's students first. Yes.
Thank you so much. Is it on? Okay. Thank you for being here today. I'm so glad that many of you mentioned thinking about how did we get here in response to 9/11, and also what will our response be this time. And I'm very interested in what the American response to this should be. One of the narratives I've heard floating around is that the attackers came in with the wave of refugees. And so there's a fear of letting refugees into our own country because the same type of attack could happen. So I think, some of you are talking about fear, talking about security, talking about the power of narratives. How do you think Americans should respond to this one? Thank you. I'd be happy to hear from any all of you.
Well, I think I don't know how many people listened to former Secretary of State Clinton's speech yesterday at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she, basically defended the Obama administration's not response, but policies that have been going on for a year and a half to 2 years in terms of combating ISIS. And I think the position of the Obama administration is that the problem of ISIS is in part a military problem, but it's largely a political problem. And I think the political problem in Iraq, for example, is a big illustration of this. Had the central government in Baghdad not alienated the Iraqi Shia after the awakening in 2006, ISIS wouldn't have been as big of a problem there today as it has become. And I think the president's remarks in the Philippines, I believe, at the G20 summit on the refugee crisis, were both sincerely held, but also recognizing politically that if we make this about a clash of civilizations or about, the entire Islamic world somehow being culpable in this, it's going to be counterproductive. Now, the bad news is that this is probably the best response the United States can come up with, and it's going to take a long, long time. And ultimately, it's going to hinge on people within the region actually making the big changes that are going to be necessary to defang ISIS. So it's a long, hard slog.
Anyone else on the panel for this question? Yes, Peter.
Yeah, not being a voter in this country, I think that would be your first assignment if you are American. Think about who to vote for in the next election. And I'm sort of shocked by what I see in the debates, and that the immigration issue becomes so coupled to this. I don't think this is primarily an immigration issue or a refugee issue. There is an organization, and that's my focus, there is an organization that managed to fund itself, managed to do the things that Olivier described, for instance. But it is this organization that we are in trouble with and have a conflict with, but not with all Muslims, not with the refugees. My country has taken in 150,000 in the last couple of months. Indiana had 20, I think. Yeah. So it is not correct, I think, to focus on that. You need to focus on exactly those that are creating the trouble and identify those rather than all Muslims. I have one objection to Michael's presentation, just to get a discussion going, and that's the word assimilation. I don't think that this is the policy we should have, is assimilation. That is to make people equal and assimilate similar, that's in there, as similar to each other. No. The idea should be some degree of integration where you still have your different identities respected, and that would be the target. And I think that's very much what the French policy has been, and that's what I think Sweden is trying to do. But it's not to make everybody into a Swede or necessarily into a Frenchman or an American, but rather have a dual or double or triple or whatever set of identities. That's where you build a vibrant society, and that's what should be our target. So our experience, for instance, just to end on that, we had about 100,000 people coming from Bosnia to this little country in the 1990s. And there are lots of studies of how things worked out with them. And the key thing seems to be really to get a job of the type that you expect. If you get that kind of a job, you are more satisfied with the society. If you don't, you are likely to be more negative about the society. And that's the kind of things I would like to add to your dimensions there. And the integration then means just being able to sustain myself and my family in this society and be accepted the way I am.
Yes.
Thank you. Jim told me that I could be as provocative as I want, so I'll try. I looked at the title, it was Paris and Beyond, but I heard no mention of Beirut, and of Nairobi. Many innocent civilians have died there too. And the other, I also have not heard an Islamic perspective on the issue of ISIS. You mentioned diversity earlier, but I wanted to hear more from an Islamic perspective on that. But I hope I'll be short. I was in Iraq this summer. I come from Iraq. I come from the west of Iraq that is under ISIS right now. And actually, my hometown was overrun by ISIS a year ago, and my family immigrated to the north. My brother is a policeman. My cousins are in the army. So this summer I asked them, and my question I asked, I said, well, you're fighting in the army. What is your motivation? What makes you fight? And my brother's point was, well, I don't want to be looked at as a coward who ran away. But really, I'm not fighting for someone who's better than ISIS. And that's the sentiment that you get from a lot of Sunnis in Iraq. We are not fighting. The army morale is really down because we're not, we have been repressed before. So when I'm fighting ISIS, fighting for what? To go back to the status quo that led us to this situation in the first place. And I think we talked about a year ago, and when I was writing my thesis, I was also in Iraq, and we had this civil disobedience movement, and everyone was saying that something bad is about to happen. We need to end the repression. We need to end the corruption of the central government that has been installed by the United States. And that has not happened, and now we are here. And I'm afraid in a few years later, we'll be at the same place. So what there can be done to end the repression and the corruption? That's first. And second, you mentioned, Professor Weinstein, that we need to follow the money. Is there a way that we can follow the guns too? Thank you.
Some responses?
Yeah, you want to go? Yeah, go ahead.
Just one word. Okay, when you say you want to hear more about Islam, I have a question for you. To what extent is what happened in Paris related to Islam? That's my question. And I can refine it a little bit. What we know about the background of the protagonists of this attack is that their way of life, for example, I mean, I'm talking about a sociological thing. Their way of life, okay. The cafe in Belgium that the two brothers owned was shut down by the authorities because of the use of drugs. The young woman who was killed in Saint-Denis by the police, who committed suicide. That's more important. Who committed suicide, like some of the other protagonists, who had suicide bombs. We know that she had a life that was very frivolous. She used to drink alcohol a lot. And also the fact that they commit suicide and that they kill innocent people, that they kill, period. To what extent is that related to Islam? That's a big question, I think. I'm not saying that there is no connection at all, but what they do in the name of this religion is at stake, while we look at the way they radicalize, if that's the proper word, without going to the mosque, without really reading or knowing the Quran, etc., etc. I'm just, providing sociological facts about the perpetrators. And that is something that they have in common with the Kouachi brothers, with Koulibaly last January, and other similar attackers. Now, the other thing is, following this question that I'm raising, is what is the framework to understand the act of killing that's involved at this scale in those attacks? In other words, what I would ask is there a difference? And I will be very careful while raising this question. I mean, it's just thinking while asking the question. But is there a difference between the leader of this attack, who's boasting on the internet, posting selfies and things like that, videos, gruesome videos, and some other similar mass shootings in the world, but also in the United States, on behalf of what? In this case, this is in the name of a certain relationship that they have supposedly to Islam. But what they want to achieve could be also analyzed with the same variables that we use to sociologically try to analyze other mass shootings that occur on campuses in the United States, for example. I'm just raising these questions because I think there is a sociology. That's why I was talking about the media here. There's a sociology of this media appearance and this performative use of the media that is perpetrating attacks in order to be famous, for example, and die, okay? There are common features between those mass shootings. I'm just raising those questions.
I would like to say something, yeah. Is it correct to assume then that, because I talked about Muslim writers, and I tried to give their perspective on these attacks, so is it safe to assume that you wanted to hear somebody here on our panel who would speak from the perspective of a Muslim? Yeah.
Thank you. My question was more related to what Professor Olivier just mentioned, is that why we always, talk about extremist Muslims instead of saying terrorists. Why do we have to attach the religious affiliation of them? Why don't we treat them as the same way we treat any other mass killings that happens every day? Not every day, but happens a lot, very frequent in the United States. And the issue I take here is that just in my part of the country, the western of the country, 1,700 people, Muslims, have been killed by ISIS in a single day. So if we attach the Muslim identity to ISIS, what do you attach to those victims? That's sorry. Yeah, that's one.
Yeah, but the issue is that their activities are framed on an interpretation of Islam. It'd be sort of like trying to understand the Crusades without saying that the state of Catholic theology at the time was irrelevant to them. Certainly there were all sorts of reasons other than theology that drove the Crusades, but a particular interpretation of Christian theology at the time was a part of it. And likewise, ISIS, whether it's a minority, well, it certainly is a minority position in the Muslim world, nonetheless claims to be advancing a Muslim agenda. And yeah, a lot of the people that are fighting for ISIS are probably doing it for a mixture of reasons, but that's been true throughout history. So I think trying to sweep the fact that this is that there's a political theological element to this under the rug is a mistake. It's a mistake, A, because it's obvious that it's there, but it's also a mistake, B, because the solution might in part be the war of ideas. If we accept the argument that this is a fight for the soul of Islam, then that shapes how we think about it, and that's a different way of fighting the war than with drone strikes or other means of combating the war. So, I think to say that it's, you're not saying this, but I'm hearing you say that Islam doesn't have much to do with it, I think is a mistake.
We're running short on time, so what I propose to do is we have two people who wanted to ask questions. If you could just combine yours somehow, and then I'll ask the panel. I'm hoping that somehow they can be synthesized. And then I'm going to ask the panel, each of the members, for some responses or statements, and then I also have something to say. You had your hand up. George did, and you also had your, no. So George, it turns out that just one question.
One thing that I wanted to mention is that Peter's point that follow the money, and looking at the financial part of the story where the soldiers of ISIS get $700 a month every month, while the Iraqi soldiers get $200 to $300 every 6 months, is an important part of the story, and it should be addressed. However, in Notre Dame, I thought that there are two more important questions to be addressed. One is, we just started now discussing it, that in my opinion, religion is a necessary condition for these developments, whether it is the Crusades or whether it is ISIS. The fact that for these people there is another life where the rewards in this other life are much more important than the ones in this life. Is an important part of the equation and of the motivation. And so we cannot abstract from the religion of Islam in this case, that some people are going to get, saved if they exterminate infidels, etc., etc. That is one part of the story that has to be addressed. The other part, which in my opinion the most important question, is that there are people who have been exposed to the highest level of Western culture that come from Oxford and from Cambridge and from Harvard and have joined ISIS. And this is, for me, a big, big problem that we haven't understood and we haven't even studied. What is it that creates this phenomenon? Because if we are going out there and bombing them, and it is in urban areas, which means that we are creating much more victims. And on the other hand, we get them replaced by other people who have been exposed to the highest, to the pinnacle of Western culture. We are in a very bad perspective. So this is the two questions that I wanted to raise: the necessity of religion and the motivation of the people who are not the ones that are in the bottom of our societies, but the ones that are at the top and still join ISIS.
Thank you. Perhaps we can start with Catherine and ask you to respond to these questions, but then also for the rest of the panel to make whatever statements they want to make.
Well, I'm not a specialist on ISIS by any means, but I do know that they have theologians who are very well versed in the Quran and Quranic studies, and can justify everything. They've read all the hadiths. For instance, the Jordanian pilot who was burned several months ago, they had a series of justifications, very well reasoned and demonstrated. There's no problem for them. It's just we are the ones who are having a huge reaction. But so I wouldn't be surprised that there are some highly educated people who would be attracted by the community. The fact, I think that having a home, one thing we didn't say about the non-assimilation in France is that many of the Muslims in France come from a worker background. It's a very different kind of immigrant in Europe generally than in the United States, where most of the Muslims come with a degree or get a degree here and have a good job. So that would explain partly the difference in their level of satisfaction. But yes, the idea of really having their own home, I think, is a very powerful one for people who live in a nation that they don't recognize as their own.
Peter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. A couple of reflections. I talk about it constantly as IS or whatever, the name, the organization. For me, it's more an organization than a religion that we are in trouble with here. I just listened to a Swedish journalist who was coming with the Kurdish forces into a place where IS had been, and there were dead people around there, IS soldiers. The Kurdish soldiers ran up to them and they wanted one thing, and that was the first aid kit. Each of the IS soldiers had excellent first aid kits, which meant that you can, like American soldiers would have, very expensive, and that is a way you can stop the bleeding and so on and so forth. In other words, these soldiers were not equipped to die, they were there to fight. And they were soldiers, so I don't think this thing that you get a reward somewhere in a paradise or whatever is really the driving force of this or explains this. It is something much more traditional soldier kind of thinking, I think. They want to fight, as you said, and I agree, they are paid to do these things. But I think there might be a higher purpose, and that is that they want to protect their own people. And that was my basic thesis here, that the Sunni population is not protected by the governments in those countries, in Iraq and Syria, and that's why it is difficult for many Sunnis to go against IS, because what is their alternative? A government who will not protect them. So that's why I think the solution out here from this is really to find a way in which you can legitimately and in a good way connect to the Sunni population. Your question about arms, which is fine. But to get weapons, you need money. If you have weapons, you can get money. So there is some interplay there. What I'm most dissatisfied with is the inability of the international community to impose an arms embargo. One should have done that immediately, but instead the attitude has been, no, we will put in more money and more weapons on each side. And Russia is putting in, so we have to put in, and we are putting in, so the others, etc. So you escalate, and we know there are good statistics showing that the more people involved in a conflict, the more weapon you are putting into a conflict, of course, the more complicated it becomes, the more destructive it becomes, the more difficult it becomes to stop it. And the fact that the UN Security Council and basically the big powers have not been able to agree on that kind of a strategy, stopping weapon flows, and instead gone the other way around. I think that's one of the reasons why we sit with this particular problem that we have here. So I think one should see and analyze the Arab world more carefully, as I suggested, as a very fragmented world. And the question is, where can there be indigenously built coalitions that will sustain a society and make people in that society secure? That's the kind of things we need to look for. And that's where we should have the searchlight, I think, if we're going to solve this problem.
Thank you, Peter. Mike?
I feel like I'm having my revenge on Gunnar Myrdal by arguing with Peter. Remember, Myrdal had a very pointed and I think, ultimately fair critique of the racial situation in the United States in the 1950s. And I'm making, I think, a similar sort of critique of Europe, particularly on the issue of secularism. The one thing I would say is when we think about secularism in Europe today, particularly in France, what we think about is the headscarf ban. Mm-hmm. And when that upset people for very understandable reasons, what did they do? Well, they said, okay, Jews can't wear kippas and Christians can't wear crosses. I would submit that that is a very different approach than the one that we would take in the United States, and I think that that doesn't help in terms of religious people feeling at home in a given society where that's the response rather than some different response.
Like that's a French response, it's not a European response.
Well, I guess I'm going to be the French guy here. I have a few remarks.
Throwing the French under the bus.
First thing, okay. First, an observation about ISIS, finances. ISIS is a very rich, very wealthy organization. You probably know that. We are in a university, and I think you might also know that of the $2,000 billion that ISIS have, 20% comes from the smugglers who are selling antiquities. If there is something that we could do, we could raise attention to that. Of course, there's oil, and there are also robberies, all kinds of criminal activities that this criminal organization has. That's an observation. But to come back to the French, the French guy, okay. And talk about the French Muslims or the Muslims of France. These are very different categories too, because the vast majority of the Muslims, the 5 million Muslims in France, they are French citizens. What we have to say here, and that's in line with what Michael just said about the scarf, the controversy over the scarf is a very racist and xenophobic controversy in France. And there's a reason to that, which is also the reason why the so-called assimilation or integration, I'm always very careful while using those words, because assimilation, for example, is a medical term that's used for digestion. And digesting is not what we want to do. We don't want to destroy them. But we are also caught up within the nasty power of those categories sometimes. And assimilation is a very political term in the French landscape, and a very toxic term that the far right is using, for example, to try to explain the Muslims, the immigrants, and their descents that they have to renounce in a French fashion, okay? That they have to renounce their religion, the veil, their traditions, the way they eat, the way they, etc., the way they have fun also, the parties and everything. The religious celebrations, etc., etc. So there is a very racist stream in France. You certainly know that, and there's a reason also for that. We have not pronounced this word here so far, but the vast majority of the French Muslims are post-colonial populations who have encountered the violence of the French colonial power and empire over the past 150 years, and sometimes way more than that. So those Muslims also have a very, very profound experience of not being assimilated by the French. And the French ask them to assimilate, but they are also repressed and excluded by the French society. Now, the second point I would like to make is deals with, again, assimilation and immigration with regard to Islam. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that 40% of the radicalized young people, mostly, who joined ISIS in France are French white Caucasians. This has nothing to do with immigration, with assimilation. They are completely assimilate, if you want to say that. One thing that, again, struck me but did not surprise me is that the first accounts that the witnesses and victims of the concert hall said, oh, they spoke perfect French, very well. Those are French-speaking populations. That is what I mean here. They are produced by French, by the French society, by the French education system, and by, of course, its failure. So that's one thing. The third thing I wanted to say goes back to our previous discussion about Islam. I guess I'm trying to refine the question, okay, for you and for us. The question would be the following. Why is Islam a name that allows those young people to become active and perpetrate those acts of killing, in light of what I just said, that 40% of them, like the guy who read the communique, for example, he's a French guy. a French, white, Caucasian guy. I mean, as you could not find a more French profile than his, okay? So I guess that is in line with what I said about the mass shootings in general and the relationship that mass shootings have to the perpetration of a visual cinematic violence. One thing that I think would be very interesting is to look at the profile of those political assassinations, killers, and discover what Catherine very pertinently mentioned a few minutes ago, the fact that they all have in common that they have all been through unemployment, relegation. They are the outcasts, they are the second, the third class citizens of society. And in a way, what they are trying to do is to redeem their sense of being completely neglected in the society in turning this into a super media power, super cinematic power in the performance of violence in a suicidal way also. I guess that's all. Thank you.
Before we conclude, I want to say that we invited among our fellows every fellow who's Muslim, and they're all at 2 different conferences this weekend. So we intend to have in the new year a panel on Islam and terrorism, and that we hope will be very enlightening, the 2 institutes. It occurs to me that what we'll also try to do will be to have a panel, the 2 institutes and perhaps the law school, on the implications of counterterrorism for democracy, which is a subject that hasn't directly come up today, but is a subject that concerns all of us directly, whether Europeans or Americans. So what a terrific panel. I want to thank all of our panelists. And thank you for coming.
Nice to meet you. Peter, it was a pleasure. It's like the one we had before.
Pardon me?
Wonderful.
Catherine, nice to
Nice
meet
to
you.
meet you too. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Fascinating to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, good. Good.
Please thank our friend.
Of course.